Today for our video, we're going to be reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Chapter 1. We'll read like 3 or 4 pages. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck at all, though he had a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very use as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences spying on the neighbors. The Dursley's son, called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out the Potters. Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley's sister. They hadn't met for several years, in fact. Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't even have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as they could possibly be. The Dursleys shuddered to think that what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived up the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they didn't even ever see him. The boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky to suggest that strange, mysterious things would be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tall-teeth owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase and pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing a cigarette at the walls. Mr. Dursley left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen, and he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light, Mr. Dursley had been thinking of. It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dudley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little snake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward downtown, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. That's the end of episode 1. Hope y'all enjoyed it.